Thank you, Jens, and thank you to the organizers. And hopefully, bear with me because this is actually the first time that I'm going to be speaking on the issue in terms of, and I'm not going to actually be talking so much about the Syrian revolution and the uprising and the dynamics of what's taking place in Syria, but more of the local context. So I guess the talk is a bit backwards, and in terms of how do we as the left sort of relate to the Syrian revolution, how do people who are active, I asked particularly to speak about people who've been active and particularly how the debate has been reflected or situated in Palestine solidarity organizing here and the local context. And also I want to reflect a bit about some of the practice, because a lot of the times when we have these debates and they become too abstract, we forget about how debates carry themselves out in practice. And so I want to actually situate some of the discussion in terms of the practice of the group and collective that I'm part of to Damen and how it's related to the Syrian revolution and also the question of Palestine. So I'm just going to try to do that briefly, and because I think people really want to understand the dynamics and what led to the Syrian revolution. And I think the first point that I really want to make, and I think the stress in terms of the debate that took place or is still taking place on the left and is becoming, unfortunately, not clear, it's not actually creating sort of a positive dialectic, but it's actually has only become sharper, that there's no synthesis actually being produced by the debate currently, even though some writers, such as maybe as Asad Abu Khalil, while there's still debates in terms of his position, some beginnings of openings in terms of the debate, because the debate has really been about the role of the anti-war left, and in terms of the question of challenging Western imperialism, and that particularly means a sort of a lack of support for what the Syrian uprising and the democratic revolution in Syria by focusing on certain elements of the opposition or reactionary groups that are funded by regional powers, and not equating sort of the presence of both U.S. hegemony and also declining U.S. hegemony and Russian interference in Syria on the same sort of level with the same agenda, and can debate that after. But I think fundamentally the anti-war left saw the Syrian uprising, I think in a way that was wrong, is just simply that there was a continuity of what was taking place in the Arab world. From the new American century to the invasion of Iraq to what's taking place now across the Arab world is simply just a continuity and sort of fits in that narrative and sort of neglects the Arab Spring or the uprisings that took place as not being genuine or authentic, but fits a narrative of regime change across the region without any of the local conditions or that actually created and led to what we saw in 2011 up until this moment. And I think one thing that's really important about that in understanding Syria as well as the case in Egypt, which I've written about more, is that a lot of these struggles weren't spontaneous. And I think that's fundamental, that they just didn't appear in 2011, that there were movements on the ground trying to challenge very similar conditions for quite a lengthy period, to challenge the authoritarian regimes both in Syria and Egypt and Tunisia to varying degrees and varying levels of organization. But essentially there were movements on the ground much previous to 2011 who were trying to open up that space to build the kind of movements that would create change in the region. So I think the question of continuity is really, I think it's fundamental, in that with the anti-war left is that it has to grapple with that question. Sort of, and the other element in terms of, I think, the anti-war left and with the Syria uprising is that the question of that sort of taking what's place in Syria sort of out of a context of what's taking place in the entire region, but in a very bad way. I think the debate that is raged in terms of the level of intervention, in terms of and I think Joseph will talk about it more, the question of regime change in Syria and who's being funded who, and the question of sectarianism is also a failure of the anti-war left. The question of sectarianism didn't start in Syria. The question of sectarianism actually started in Iraq. And it started in Iraq when the U.S. was actually losing the occupation, when it was losing to an insurgency between 2004 and 2006, that the only way that they would be able to stop an insurgency in Iraq is essentially by funding the people that were opposed to the previous regime. And it clearly outfitted and funded a paramilitary police unit that was mainly Shia, and that's when you begin to have a sectarian discourse and a sectarian language actually come up in Iraq. That sort of led to the conditions of ISIS, and particularly, I mean, it was the Islamic State of Iraq before it became the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant. So I think in terms of sectarianism and sort of also what took place, it was actually I think the majority of it was a result of the occupation of Iraq. And I think for the anti-war left, if we actually want to deal with Islamic fundamentalism, the question of the rise of reactionary forces in the region, then we actually have to refocus our efforts to demand an end to American intervention, an end to American funding out of Iraq, but also the region as a whole. And sorry, I'm losing myself a bit. And I think, sorry, I'm gonna re-step back. Sorry. In terms of when thinking about when the debate, the anti-war movement, in terms of sort of we have to stop our own imperialism, right? That we have to focus on the question of the goals of our own ruling elite in terms of their agenda in the region. And it's very clear, I mean, for them, what are the two main goals? One is to secure Israeli stability, and the other, so to maintain Israeli apartheid. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's opposed to certain reactionary forces in the region. If it could integrate them, then it will. Even most recently in Egypt, obviously the U.S. military wasn't actually, the U.S. government wasn't opposed to the Muslim Brotherhood. Its attempts to relate to the Muslim Brotherhood was to be able to to integrate them into the needs of U.S. imperialism in the region. And they used the IMF loan as a way to guarantee that it would maintain Camp David. On the other hand, the Syrian state sort of claimed that we opposed Camp David. We oppose the U.S. agenda in the region. We are part of this axis of resistance. When it's clear that they have been trying to and wanting to, Bashar al-Assad explicitly trying to make an agreement with Israel over Golan. It wasn't that Bashar al-Assad didn't want peace with Israel. It's actually, and I think Gilbert Ashkar was correct, that it's actually the opposite. Israel didn't want peace with Bashar al-Assad. That Israel sort of accepted the status quo. And I think that is a fundamental point. And that also, in terms of understanding the dynamics of the Syrian struggle, is that a democratic revolution in Syria is profoundly harmful. And I think a democratic revolution anywhere in the Arab world is profoundly harmful to the U.S. agenda. And I think it's profoundly harmful also to all reactionary forces in the region. Nobody wants to see the Syrian revolution win. Nobody wants to see the Egyptian revolution win. Nobody wants to see the Tunisian revolution win. Because if any of these uprisings actually succeed, then these authoritarian regimes not only will crumble, but also a sense of solidarity will take place. And I think it will be a bigger threat to Israeli apartheid, to the Saudi regime, into regional forces that are trying to carve out their interests against the will of people in the region. So I think in terms when we think about Palestine solidarity and we think about the anti-war left, the best way to challenge imperialism in the region and to challenge our own governments on a theoretical level is that we have to be foundationally in support of these revolutions and these revolutionary struggles. No matter when the debate says, well, they're only a small minority. Who are you talking about? Much of the debate is characterized, well, what forces, what movements? And I think there are those movements and there are those forces on the ground, but we also have to make that stance principally as well. Simply because we can't find the people en masse that we can relate to. I mean, the left is receding, has been totally brutalized in the Arab world for the past 60 years, right? You're not going to see the same kind of mass organizations that you're going to see in other parts of the world. It was completely repressed by all of the regimes. So, of course, the similar kind of mass organizations that we could relate to don't exist in the same way in the region. And I think that's fundamental. And also in terms of Syrians themselves, people in the Syrian uprising have shown immense will to show their solidarity with people in Palestine. Actually, during the latest the invasions on Gaza in 2014, there were protests in Aleppo in solidarity with the people of Gaza. There was a statement signed by Syrians in support of solidarity with the people of Gaza, with the Palestinian struggle. And that their statement that until the road for liberation for Palestine is actually through the liberation of Syria. And that fundamentally those struggles are linked. So I think in terms of a perspective of the anti-war movement, I think the best way we can stop both U.S. imperialism, both Russian intervention, is by supporting the democratic revolution. And Tadamen, the collective that I'm part of, we've existed now for 10 years, but actually our first campaign was to delist actually Hezbollah in 2006 as a concrete measure to stand in solidarity with resistance struggles in the Middle East, and also to call for an end of Israeli apartheid, but also to stand in solidarity with all movements across the Arab world who are fighting for social justice, dignity, and self-determination. And I don't think there's a contradiction. So when we focused on BDS, but when the Arab Spring actually happened and when those uprisings took place and those demonstrations took place, it was clear that we stood in solidarity with those uprisings and the work that we tried to do in 2012, a statement that we issued, and we got mass organizations, unions to sign on. CSN, the second largest union in Quebec, actually endorsed, was to support the uprising for self-determination in Syria and no to any foreign intervention in Syria. And I think and also one of the things that we also fundamentally worked on is trying to concretely support groups in Syria and also in the camps in Lebanon concretely in a way, because I think that's one of the things, the failures of the left generally, is that concrete forms of solidarity on top of the larger demonstrations, on top of the larger movements, build that infrastructure of dissent. Build those linkages that we actually desperately need in these movements, and also show that they have a voice outside of Syria and that they can build on links as well, not just reactionary forces. one of the things that we did was to actually to even depass the NGOs in Lebanon and to work with grassroots activists to directly send aid to Syrian refugees in Lebanon, working on an sort of anti-authoritarian, democratic basis, where the money and all of the resources went directly to the Syrian refugees in the Bekaa. And I think fundamentally one of the things that I actually want to end with is the refugee question. And I was asked to speak about it. And it's what I do as a full-time, I guess, job as an organizer at the Immigrant Workers Center, is that unfortunately the refugee question has become extremely depoliticized. I think part of even the reason why people now are paying attention to Syria maybe more than they did during the beginnings of the uprisings is because Syrians themselves actually created another uprising, not inside the borders of Syria, but essentially by marching to Europe. That essentially what it was the last scream of Syrians saying that you've oppressed us, you've bombed us, but that doesn't mean we won't die quietly. That doesn't mean that we will sit here and suffer in the camps in Lebanon and in Turkey, that we'll seek what you've taken away from us. And I think now, unfortunately, it's become, I mean, in the Canadian context, it's become highly depoliticized. Everyone, in Winnipeg, somebody has a birthday party. I brought a Syrian refugee with me. It's like having a cat. But it was highly politicized. It was highly depoliticized when it was highly political. Most of the refugees that were allowed to come were privately sponsored. The state essentially privatized its refugee program in terms of Syrians. It was highly sectarianized. It was extremely sectarianized. And the other issue is that it didn't want to actually to help all Syrians. I mean, single men were not allowed to come under the program. The program's already been cut after 1 year, essentially to only 1,000 Syrian. And sort of this claim that we have a different approach to the Syrian refugee crisis is to, let's say, Europe, which is closing its borders now, or to the US, is absurd. It has the exact same approach and is just using different, it just has a different face to that approach. And one of the things that's actually now happening with the Syrian refugees, it's become a bargaining chip for regional powers as well. Egypt just entered, actually, if you want us to take Syrian refugees, we demand money from the EU. Jordan has done the same thing. Lebanon has relegated Syrian refugees into permanent second-class citizens. So for people who don't know, all of the Syrian refugees in Lebanon can only work 2 jobs, either in agriculture or construction. They have none of the same rights, same benefits. So this idea that there's an interest in regime change, and sort of the Friends of Syria is a bit of a joke when you look at the question of how Syrians themselves have been treated by Western states outside of Syria. So, and I think that's one of the things that we can play a role concretely as a progressive movement, as forces, as a movement, is not simply to demand an end to intervention, and also solidarity with those forces fighting for a democratic revolution, but also to concretely support Syrians here with those politics in a very politicized way. I think will have a huge impact, not just on our struggles here to open the borders, but also on the struggle itself in Syria. And maybe I'll just end there. Thank you. Forget it. I was going to say one more thing, but sorry. I do have one more thing to say very quickly. And one of the things, when the uprisings began in 2011, Tariq Ali made a sort of a comparison to 1848. He quickly withdrew from that comparison, actually, but I think he was wrong to actually withdraw from that comparison of the revolutions in 1848. Yes, they did face great defeats and setbacks, but they also led to the creation of organization of solidarity across Europe, which was the First International, or was the International Workmen's Association, that challenged not just British or French imperialism, but all imperialisms across the region in terms of crushing movements across Europe for democracy, for social justice. It never equated, in the First International, it never equated a difference between Tsarist Russia in terms of what it was doing in collusion with Britain at that time. And that working people had a necessity to fight all forces of reaction, not just the British and not just the French, but all forces oppressing. And so I think, again, we have the challenge to build that and uniting all those struggles across the Arab world, from Palestine to Syria to Egypt, and linking that with movements here. That, I think, is also our major priority. That's it.